In this EventSentry training session, we're going to look at ADMonitor and how to configure and administer that component. Again, in the management console under ADMonitor, we have our dialog where we see the service, the status of the service. We can see which service account it's running under, and the service account is hard-coded. You cannot rename that currently, but you can, of course, change the password. We can see in which database ADMonitor stores its action. And we can also see that there's a warning message in regards to the health status that the group policy management feature is not installed. So this is not critical, but it is required to monitor group policy. So if you installed ADMonitor on a host that is not a domain controller, then the group policy management is not installed by default, and you can easily and quickly install it with Server Manager. So just pull up Server Manager. I'm going to click on Add Roles and Features, and we're just going to navigate through this with next until we get to Features, and we're going to select Group Policy Management, hit Next, and hit Install. Installation succeeded. We're going to close this, go back here, and it automatically detects here in the background that the group policy management feature is installed, and we're all good in that sense. Now this is just a basic status of ADMonitor. We can see a little bit more in the actual ADMonitor administrator. So ADMonitor is the only component in EventSentry that has its own separate application, management application. You can get to it through the start menu, of course, but also through the GUI here. And yeah, what do we see here? We see the service status here again. So it's the same status we have here, the name of the service and the user it's running under. Again, EventSentry ADMonitor is hard-coded. And that user does have to be an enterprise admin because it is monitoring Active Directory, and a regular domain admin generally doesn't have sufficient privileges, especially if you have subdomains. If you're just running this on a single domain, being a domain admin usually is sufficient. But if you want to monitor subdomains as well, then it has to be an enterprise admin. Down here we can see which domain it's actually monitoring. So we're monitoring the training.eventsentry.local domain here. And we can also see to which domain controller it's connected to. So ADMonitor currently automatically finds the closest domain controller and connects to that. You can monitor, you can configure some filters here. In this particular case, we're filtering out some noise from the activity. You can also manage data files and automatically delete, for example, data that's older than 120 days. What's important to note here, this data does not affect information you see in the web reports. ADMonitor has its own offline AD database that you're managing with this. But once it's written to the EventSentry database, the actual SQL database, it will stay there for as long as you keep it in there, and that's essentially controlled with the usual EventSentry database purging utilities through the web reports or the command line utilities. But EventSentry ADMonitor does have its own Active Directory cache, so to speak. So there's a difference between viewing the data in the database. So if we go to features here and look at ADMonitor here, right, we have all these 5 features here. So this is information that ADMonitor already reported to the EventSentry database. So for example, going through object changes, and let's take a look and go back to the last 30 days. So that's information that ADMonitor sent to the SQL Server database. But we can also look at the data directly in ADMonitor, in the native ADMonitor cache, and we get to that through that viewer icon. We just hit OK here. I'm going to go back down to the last 30 days. You can filter this out a little bit more to only see objects created, modified, and so forth. We can hide this little pop-up here like this. And here you can see the type of objects that have been created. For example, you can see that organizational units were created with no previous values, for example. Object details, of course, anytime you click an object, you're going to see object details. But in any case, this information is directly in ADMonitor. So this is a really good way for troubleshooting. So if you're suspecting something's not working right, maybe something is not showing up in a database, the first thing you want to do is open up the viewer through the management console and see, do we have data in here? If there's data in here, that means ADMonitor is working, it's capturing, monitoring changes. But if there's no data in here, then there's no point in even worrying about any sort of database issues, because it means that ADMonitor isn't properly working. So like we looked earlier, the first step would be go to this dialog, make sure everything is green and running. Then we can look at the administrator to see, okay, is it connected to a domain? If that's the case, if that works too, well, then we can take a look at the viewer. Obviously, if you just installed ADMonitor, the viewer may be empty if no changes have occurred yet. So you can always go into Active Directory and create like a test user or just make a minor change to an object. And if data is in here, well, then that's a pretty good indication that ADMonitor is working correctly. But again, this is data in ADMonitor, has nothing to do with the data in the web reports. So what you see here is essentially a copy of what's available, what's shown right here. You can purge data from here. It won't affect data in ADMonitor and vice versa. And the last thing we're going to look at is the actual ADMonitor data. If you go into the installation directory, program files, EventSentry, by default, there is an ADMonitor folder here. And in here, you can see this is where the admin utilities are located. And the DB directory, this is where the ADMonitor database is stored. Depending on the size of your Active Directory and how long ADMonitor has been running, that size may be a few megabytes to hundreds of megabytes, for example. In this case, it's 500 megabytes, which is something you could expect to be the minimum size of ADMonitor, because what we have here is just a test domain with a few user accounts. But it shouldn't grow too much. Again, any type of change that occurs is going to increase the size, because all changes, all transactions are stored in this cache. So like I mentioned, if you wanted to control that and conserve disk space, you can always go back here to the administrator and configure the data file management here.